I was struck by a lyric in Step on this album, which was wisdom's a gift, but you'd trade it for youth. Age is an honor, but it's still not the truth, which is a great lyric.
Oh, thanks.
But also, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I don't know how you're old enough to know that.
Well, yes, nobody in Vampire Weekend is that old yet, but there certainly has been something of a transformative period over the past few years.
In what sense?
Well, just the kind of rate at which things changed. You know, being in college, briefly working, and then suddenly, you know, touring the world. It does kind of like create some sort of you cross some sort of line, and then you come back and you start to reflect on everything, and suddenly you do feel a lot older. Sometimes it's hard to believe. There's something about touring too, the way time passes. Sometimes it's hard to believe that you've been to all these places, and then it's like, oh, you know, we're back here, back in Brussels again. When was the last time we were? It does make you think a little bit about the way time passes, and so when you come back, yeah, it naturally makes you a little more reflective, and you think about, you know, growing up, where you were when you started, where you've been. I mean, I get, yeah, everybody thinks in those terms to some extent, but there's something about being in a band that maybe exacerbates it.
It's interesting because you said leaving college, working briefly, then going out on tour, which implies that this isn't working.
I've always had a hard time thinking of being in a band as a real job. It's certainly work, but I don't know. When I compare it to being a teacher, one feels like real work, and one feels like a difficult, stressful, passionate hobby. I mean, and that's just me. Maybe, you know, just in my own mind, I have to think about it as being different. Like, it, you know, arguably being in a band is a really intense job. I mean, sometimes, you know, you have to work weekends. Arguably, you're working every minute. But yeah, to think of it as work or as a true job, I can't. I can't. Sometimes I think, you know, I was in college, then I had a job, then I was in a band. Maybe one day I'll have a real job again, but I don't think I could ever think of this as a job, which is not to say that it's easy, but it's just something else.
It is kind of in its own category.
Yeah. And
if it became work, you probably wouldn't want to do it.
Well, maybe that's the thing that I'm scared of, is because I've seen plenty of bands who start to think of it as a job, and then, you know, every few years you put out an album. That's what you're supposed to do, because that's your job. And if you didn't do it, you wouldn't be doing your job. But we've always kind of waited until like the good ideas came to us, and we had to feel very strongly about an idea. You know, it kind of feels like putting the cart before the horse to start thinking about, like, oh, this is my job. The reason that we release albums is because we're musicians. Whereas I feel like the reason that we're musicians is because we have something to say via our albums. And if the day comes where we don't really have any ideas, I can't imagine that we'd ever be able to just kind of throw something together. We would just get too depressed. We get depressed when we hear a mix of a song that sounds a little bit off. So to imagine that we'd release an entire album that we weren't excited about seems impossible. But luckily, now that we've done 3, hopefully we've bought ourselves a little bit of time. You know, like with this record, it took a little bit longer than we expected. We worked on it for about, well, the time in between the records ended up being about 3.5 years. If you'd asked me, you know, back in the Contra days, how quickly do you want to get your next album out, I would have said something much shorter than 3.5 years.
Yeah.
But now that we're here, it feels about right, and it's good that we took our time with it.
How does it feel different for you?
This album?
Yeah.
it's funny to compare the 3 albums because even though I was a part of the creative process for all 3, in some ways when I look back to the first album, you know, that time seems so distant to me. It's hard for me to fully remember how things felt. To me, it feels very natural. I kind of feel like we're doing the same thing that we've always done. Some things change, but when I picture, I mean, it's like we were talking about before in the early days, when I picture my memories of whatever, working on songs and writing with Rostam. I picture us being 18 in his dorm room, sitting in front of his computer, making some sort of demo of the song Bren. Then I picture the apartment he and CT had in Greenpoint right when they graduated, and me taking the bus up from Bed-Stuy, and us, you know, like working on Oxford Com or working on A-Punk and, you know, hearing some of the flute parts for the first time. And then, you know, I picture this album. It's kind of like sitting at his apartment where he lives now, him playing me some stuff on piano, us talking about it. So some things change, of course, but it does kind of all boil down to the same basic idea of kind of this collaborative project of writing and recording songs. Mm-hmm. So of course every album hopefully is reflective of the time period in which it was made. Mm-hmm. I'd like to think that I've changed a little bit and hopefully learned something since I graduated from college, and probably everybody changes a little bit. But then there's some part of me that just doesn't believe that. It does kind of feel like nobody changes, everybody's the same, and I guess it's for other people to look at the 3 albums and kind of see the way that they, you know, I can step back and try to, and I can come up with some decent explanations of the way that, you know, each album changed and expanded our universe, but you have to be so immersed in the album that you're making. So yeah, I don't know. It's a hard question to answer. I'd like to think that when all's said and done and people look back on the records that we've made, everyone will feel equally Vampire Weekend. I don't know what the adjective is. Vampire Weekend-y. But each one will be kind of evocative of a different time period. I think that's the best that you can hope for as a band.